Ram. I'm going to just start with asking the three of you to just, as briefly as you can, just sum up your books and the core themes that you decide to explore.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Neema. My novel is called Kololo Hill, and it's set in 1972, just before the expulsion, actually. And it tells the story of Asha and her husband Pran, both recently married, who are forced to leave everything behind except their devastating secrets. And it also follows their whole family from Uganda to London, but not necessarily everyone makes it there. So without telling too many spoilers, that's the novel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hafsa Zayyan. My novel is We Are All Birds of Uganda. It's a dual narrative, so it's split into two timelines. There's a historic narrative which follows and tracks the life of a South Asian Ugandan immigrant living in Uganda. It starts in 1945 and tracks the history all the way through to 72 and onwards. The contemporary narrative is set in modern-day Britain, and it follows a story of a second-generation Ugandan Asian immigrant who's living in London, and he's just trying to figure out his kind of calling and his path in life. And at some point, the two stories collide. So that's what mine's about.
Thank you. My name is Ram. One of the challenges of being a member of the diaspora is facing not the range of cultural differences that one is already used to, but new cultural differences. And in the case of my new book, of course, what that can mean in the British context. When I took over a seafood factory in Scotland, arriving at Aberdeen Airport on my first visit, I was received by a very glum-looking Scotsman, Foster Galt. You know, you can tell a glum face across any culture in this world. He had a placard, Highland Seafoods, the company had acquired. I went up to him, introduced myself, and almost instantly, this glum-looking man smiled. We went to the factory. We were met by a glum-looking reception committee. Foster introduced me as the new managing director. As I went through the factory, one by one, I saw very glum-looking faces turn into beaming, smiling faces. 3 months later, as I got to know the people better, I asked Foster, when I arrived, you all looked glum and miserable, and then suddenly, you all looked very happy. He said, well, Ram, to tell you the truth, we were expecting an Englishman.
Thank you. So I'm going to just open up this discussion by talking about the significance of the double diaspora experience versus single, and because that's what this is all centered around, is this sort of twice uprooted story. So I'll come to you, Neema, first. How, you know, what did you come across during your research, the stories that specifically defined this particular type of migration?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one thing that is worth mentioning is that for those who were expelled, not everyone was a twice migrant, I suppose. You know, some had come from India and had gone to Uganda, others had been born there. So I think that in itself was really interesting to me, is the different perspectives of those two generations and how they felt obviously about leaving Uganda, perhaps the only country they've known, versus those who'd already had to go through it. And even within that, I suppose, you know, those experiences for those who left India would have been quite different. Predominantly for the males, they would have had a choice in leaving. Predominantly for the women, they were most likely forced to go there one way or another by husbands and fathers and so on. So that in itself, I think, is quite interesting. The other thing I'll just say about the research, though, was for me, maybe mine was a bit more unusual in that I didn't actually speak to anyone directly about the experiences. I didn't know any Ugandan Asians. My family are from Kenya and Tanzania. It was only after I started writing the book, and I'd done a lot of research in other areas, and there's lots of great videos that were done by the SOAS, part of the University of London, and they'd done hours and hours of interviews with Ugandan Asians, and I used that. But it was only later when I started talking about the fact that I was writing a book with my extended family that I found out that actually there were people that were caught up in the expulsion. But this is part of that whole diaspora point, I suppose, is that no one was really talking about it. So yeah, I think it was quite interesting looking at those different perspectives.
That's brilliant. And Hafsa, in your book, you have this double narrative running of two very different stories. So how did you find, when you were researching, what sort of things did you come across that then you were able to communicate through the younger character of Samir in London, who is discovering his roots, and then Hassan, who's talking from Uganda itself?
Yeah, it's actually interesting, Neema, how you define twice migrants, because I always thought of the generation that were born in Uganda as kind of being immigrants anyway. I don't know what the technical definition of dual migration or twice migration is, but I just always felt like with this group of people, they were contending with not just, two cultures and two identities, the identity of home, from where they were, and then the identity of the country they're living in, but they're contending with three now. So if you have someone like Samir, who's living in modern day Britain, he's obviously British, but he's also South Asian, and then he's also Ugandan, and he doesn't really understand the Ugandan side of his heritage. He's probably less attached to the South Asian side of his heritage as well, but of course there are so many cultural parts and aspects of that experience that he lives with, and he sees in his family. And so I just found the idea of this, these twice migrants having to contend with these three different cultures, something that was very interesting and quite personal to me as well, because I contend with three cultures. I'm of mixed heritage. I'm half West African, half Pakistani, and then of course I'm British as well. So what happened and what was happening to these twice migrants was kind of something that felt kind of quite intimate to me, even though I don't have the same history.
Thank you. And Ram, along the same point, obviously you had a very direct experience, so could you talk a little bit about that and then how that fed into how you decided to communicate that through the book?
Sure. In our case, what I observed with my family, they came with the 1947 culture of partition to Kenya. And then in 1967, when we were expelled overnight, that cultural tradition they came with hardened, like a hardening of the arteries. They were twice as much Indian as any other Indian I knew. So when I went for my first trip to India, I was 14-year-old, I was told, you touch the feet of the elders. So I went and touched the feet of the elders. All my contemporary cousins laughed and said, you crazy. We don't do that anymore. So the culture was twice written, and that made it very difficult. Marriage, for example. My sisters had to contend with the 1947 culture when it came to getting married. The whole practice was really, really tough. So to me, that was one picture I have, a very tough picture of hardened cultural arteries. Absolutely 1947, even in 67 and beyond. It was a very, very tough picture that I remember growing in the family, growing up, and especially for the girls. I really felt it for my sisters. We were easy boys. For the girls, very tough. And that explained to me one factor when I learned that the attempted suicide rate amongst young Asian women is 4 times the national average. I could see why when I saw my sisters, what they had to struggle with. It was really tough.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, in terms of the trauma side, when you're interpreting such sort of strong, heavy memories, did you come across stories, people you interviewed, I'm going to guess that you did, where perhaps it's like you said, the first time they're talking about it, and did you find that it helped you or them, perhaps, in terms of processing their whole migration experience?
Sorry. Yeah, I think in my situation, even once I found out that those people had been caught up in the expulsion, everything was talked about in a very matter-of-fact way, quite a light way. Yeah, we had to leave, we came to the UK. That could be, for some people, a survival mechanism, that they have to sort of talk about it that way. But I think a lot of people were quite keen just to leave it in the past, and that's probably why we never heard about it, how I didn't know about it, and we do have quite open conversations as a family. So I think it was possibly an element of that in terms of what I learned. But what was helpful, probably the most helpful, and why this book would be particularly special to me, is I was able to learn a lot about my own parents' upbringing, so East African upbringing in Kenya and Tanzania. I didn't know that my parents, were taught Austen and Shakespeare just like I was at school, things like that I didn't know. And my mum and dad read it before it was published, and it brought me closer to them as a result, because I learned more about their own upbringing. And it's so special to me because my dad actually died last year, but I'm so grateful to have had that experience. So I think that that's the other aspect that was really helpful.
Yeah, the sort of capturing of memories while we can.
Exactly,
has been a strong part of a lot of the literature around this period. Hafsa, from your perspective, how did the stories that you uncovered, did any trauma, grief, etc., come out during that research?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, like I said, I'm not, unlike you two, actually of East African, South Asian heritage, but my in-laws are, which is how I found out about the whole story in the first place. Because like Neema said, it's not really something that's widely talked about. We don't learn about it in school. This part of history is kind of hidden, even though if you just scratch a little bit behind the surface, you'll see there's thousands of people in the diaspora living here in the UK for all those historical reasons. But I was very intrigued to write more about a story that I felt like deserved to be more widely told, and also to explain why to the rest of the population who don't know why there are so many South Asian, East Africans living in this country now today. But I think trauma-wise, I mean, my book talks a lot about colorism, racism, anti-blackness in the South Asian community, and those were all things that were personal to me anyway. So certainly I felt, I don't know, the writing process is a little bit, it can be a little bit traumatic in and of itself if you're writing these like horrible scenes or these horrible characters and you're having to sort of like, you know, get into their minds and really kind of write their essence. It can be quite disturbing, but it can also be cathartic. I mean, one of the things that I experienced with the South Asian, East African community in particular was that some people were very willing and comfortable to talk about their stories. And I found that of the slightly older generation. My uncle-in-law, he was expelled in his mid-20s. He had very fond memories of the country. He had very detailed memories of the actual expulsion. And we talked about it at length. Whereas my father-in-law, he was only 10 when they were expelled, and he never liked to talk about it. He never wanted to go back to Uganda. He just... I think for him, the memories of it were very sort of hushed whispers and angry voices and fear. And then, you know, one of my South Asian friends who, before I wrote the novel, I had no idea that her family were South Asian Ugandan, but as I was writing it afterwards, I found out, you know, these people come out of the woodwork when you actually start talking to your friends who realize they have these backgrounds. And I said, oh, would your father like to read it? And she said, oh, he doesn't want to. So, you know, it's varied, and we mustn't be too quick to say that, oh, everybody has the same experience of talking about trauma. Even within that generation, there are differences in how it was approached.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, that it was not this homogenous experience. You know, expulsion means different things. Some people really wanted to go back and others didn't. I'd like to just touch on something that you've brought up, which I know that all of you in different ways cover in your books, which is about sort of responsibility of literature to sort of depict what happened, whether it's non-fiction, autobiographical, or fiction. And one of the core themes that doesn't always get addressed, certainly when I've been talking to people about stories about expulsion, is how the South Asian community integrated or not with the local Ugandan community and the layers of colonialism that had created that. So, Ram, what do you think about, you know, the role of fiction, of books in displaying this journey?
I think it's very important, which is why I wrote my book for my grandchildren. I literally had my grandchildren in mind, saying they need to know. They have to learn, because that is how we can improve and not make the same mistakes, maybe different mistakes. So one mistake I look back on, we never integrated. We Indians lived on our own. We had our own practices. We would meet every Sunday evening in Lighthouse in Mombasa, do our own thing. Never once did I see an African invited to our home. And it was, I look back now and think, now that really isn't on. We must learn to break barriers, integrate, and not just be caught in our own little, I use the word ghetto. And so to me, that's one lesson, one memory I look back on, think, can we learn from that to make sure we learn to go beyond just who we are in our families and community? We did it again. We came to London. We came as refugees. We arrived in '67, deported overnight. What do? Find 40 or 50, yes, relatives, meet every Sunday in this 4-bedroom corner shop, tiny space. Oh, but the kitchen was big-hearted. The food was never running out. 50 of us every Sunday meeting. So the shock when I had to go to university and live away from the shop, away from the family, was just intense. I did not know how to relate to the other, except in the shop when I had to sell cigarettes and sweets and customers. Different.
Do you mind if I just add to that? I mean, it's an interesting thing that you say because, of course, when you were in Uganda or East Africa, the reason that you were so, tightly within your specific communities was consequence of what the British had done, the way that they had structured the protectorate, in Uganda's case, so that the native population was right at the bottom. The South Asians were in this lovely middle kind of trade buffer, and then you had the Europeans right at the top. And so the fact that you weren't integrating, you could kind of attribute to the structures that had been put in place by the colonialists. I think when you came to this country, you had another reason, also colonial related, which is that you were isolated, you were on your own, you were refugees, you were banding together to find identity, to find community, to be together. And so, in both senses, I mean, of course, we can blame ourselves and say, oh, we made mistakes and we need to, be more forward-looking and be more open in the future, but there are reasons behind why these pockets of communities, and these reasons are all to do with the way in which the British colonized and, and how you guys came to this country as refugees. So
schools. I went to the Muslim school, which is ironic because we were India, Pakistan, Hindu-Muslim partition. Where do my family send me? Hindu family to Muslim school, but not to a European school. It was all, there was a Hindu Asian school, there was a European school, and there were the African schools, and we were segregated without having apartheid or segregation. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. The divide and conquer, which has served the empire well. Continuing this theme of the responsibility of literature, I'm thinking in terms of both to the past and what's its role in, ensuring we depict what happened, albeit with a creative license, but also in terms of, I'm thinking of you as, current generation writers, in terms of its responsibility to people who may be finding out about this history through things like books, TV, radio, podcasts, etc. Was this something you were very conscious of when you were researching Kololo Hill?
I think partly because obviously there's a personal element to it for me, but also because it's real life, you do feel a responsibility to convey the stories as closely to reality as possible. And that's partly why I chose to have 3 point-of-view characters in my novel, to give that broader experience. So there's Jaya, who's in her 50s, which again in itself is, in fiction, is quite rare to see older women, let alone Asian women of that age as sort of protagonists, but also Vijay, who's got a disability, he's younger, and then Asha. So that was quite important to me to sort of show the differences. But that said, we are writing fiction. I think it's quite interesting that, I was saying earlier, that Hafsa and I, my book came out about a month apart, but before that, I'm not aware of any British Asian or British stories that have been written about Uganda, which I think was quite interesting. And
There's memoir, but no fiction.
Yeah, exactly. It's fiction. But I think it's interesting that this is part of both our Asian history, but our British history. So I think there is absolutely, it's important to tell those stories. Well, I would say that because it's fiction, I think it gives you some license to be able to expand, but I think you can't be sort of talking outside of what really happened. There's one sort of example I'd give, which was in my novel, there is a friendship of sorts between an Asian character and an ethnic Ugandan character, perhaps to a level that you wouldn't necessarily have seen in Uganda, but I did base it still on research that I saw around Kenya and the Mau Mau Rising, and there were similar sort of relationships that were there that I found, anecdotal ones, albeit. So, there is an element that is still fiction, but I think it's really important for us to try and tell those stories as broadly as possible as well, not just try and tell the one story.
Yeah, and I just want to ask, did you have to push through the sort of rose-tinted spectacle look back at Uganda? Because certainly from my experience, when I talked to family about it, for many years it was very much about the childhood nostalgia, the picnics at Entebbe, etc. And it was only more recently that I've kind of got the other stories, So just carry on and then I'll move around.
Yeah.
How much, and for you, how much did you have to confront your own experiences in order to be honest because yours is obviously autobiographical, so I'll just move around.
In terms of my research, not so much, because I was actively looking for expulsion stories, and so there was a big focus on the very difficult aspects of that. But I think for my novel, I really wanted to tell obviously the protagonists are Asian, so the focus is Asians, but I try to tell the story of what it's like to be a Ugandan that was left behind and so on. And I try to do it without judgment. There's morality within these stories, but I try to do it without judgment. It's up to the reader to make up their mind about what was right, what was wrong, what caused these situations, and just try to portray it. But yeah, I think it is important to tell all sides of that story. But I also want us to be able to talk about how beautiful Uganda and the rest of East Africa is, because it's an absolutely stunning place, and we don't want to lose all the beauty and the value of that place that they left behind.
I mean, I think what I found in my research, and I talked to people from the community. I read copious things online. I mean, I watched lots of interviews, like contemporaneous interviews. But I think what I found is that there was sort of a rose-tinted memory, in the sense that the South Asian population remembered it to have been like a beautiful, lovely experience, and they didn't really think about the native population and what it might have felt like, and how they themselves were perpetuating like acts of racism towards that community. And I think, with hindsight and looking back, there was more of that kind of reflection. And some of the kind of anecdotal stories that I read, they were like, now when I look back, it seems wrong that we did X, Y, Z, or it seems bad that we had this person doing that. But, at the time, they thought it was fine. So I think that's the key area that I found. Actually, the rose-tinted glasses have come off when they reread it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm grateful to my publisher of this book. I met him when I retired at the age of 37. I met him, and his first advice to me was, it's Prabhu Guptara, he's here, write it down, Ram. Publish or perish. That was his motto for me, publish or perish. And so I wrote my first book, just around then, Sari and Chips, which was about the whole East-West culture and the response to the large suicide rate in the Asian community. I didn't want to blot it out. I think it's important we acknowledge what is going on so that we can learn, because I could see the reasons. So therefore, writing down stuff without rose-tinted glasses, look, folks, this is happening in our community. When I went on the air with Ramola Bachchan on Spectrum Radio all those years back, the calls I got, especially from men, were, oh, you're hanging out of a dirty laundry in public. And Ramola Bachchan, and you're making money out of it. That was another accusation. Ramola, bless her, came in, she said, Mr. Gidoomal has given all his proceeds to charity. It is important we as a community confront these issues, and my message was, let's talk about it, let's discuss it, let's sort it out so we don't get more young girls, or indeed young boys, attempting to take their lives, because that is the tragedy of not seeing things properly. So rose-tinted glasses are dangerous. Good to remember good stuff, but the reality can be tough. Let's not be afraid of it. We can do something about it. That's the motto in my book. Never let what you cannot do stop you from doing what you can do. With that, you can write stuff and really see reality and hopefully get a better world.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. And I think all these books and current media that's coming out about it does confront it certainly more than it has done, even in terms of the number of actual Ugandans that were killed in the Civil War. We don't even sometimes talk about what happened after the expulsion, only what happened here after the expulsion. So just moving on into the here, the sort of sense of home obviously is a big part of the migration memory narrative. So how have your own experiences of those that you're closest to who've experienced expulsion, how's that fed into the notion of home and what it means, and how you try to create it after something like an expulsion or an exile? We'll come to you and then we'll rotate. Yeah.
No, I used the time that you were speaking to think of what I was...
Sorry.
No, I'm joking. But not really. I think, look, home is a very nebulous concept for immigrants. And I think one of the things that I found since publishing my novel is that I've had a lot of feedback from... Obviously, I've had a lot of feedback from members of the South Asian, East African diaspora, but I've also had feedback from other immigrant communities who said, even though this wasn't a story about my specific experience, I've taken so much from this book, it's resonated with me so much. So I think, this idea of what is home is one of those ideas. And again, it's something that my novel explores. It's very difficult as an immigrant to define. I think where I get to, in my own life and in my own experiences, and probably where I reach with the novel as well, although it's all left a little bit ambiguously, is that, home is something that's not really defined by the place that you live in, but by the people that you live with and how they make you feel, whether they treat you as feeling as feeling like you belong. And I think that's probably what I saw in my kind of, and again, just going back to what you were saying earlier, this is why we form these communities, so that we can feel like we belong in a country that isn't, where we were born. Like, why did we come here and just build these little communities? We wanted to find a home away from home. So yeah, I think it's quite a difficult one to answer, but I hope I've had a stab at it.
No, thank you. And Ram, there was a line in your book that I found quite interesting, where you wrote, it's a paradox of the immigrant, that you have a constant homesickness everywhere you are. So just centered around that, like what did that mean for you and your family when you came to the UK?
I mean, the first thing we looked for is ghee and chevra and chapati flour, and we wanted to rebuild that home feeling. Ghar ka khana, this is home food. Dad would go all the way to Southall to pick this up when we were in Shepherd's Bush, just to recreate the same smells. I was leaving my house this morning and my wife said, I can smell Indian food. It does something to you. That's your home. But I suppose for me today, home is where my heart is. And it's family, primarily family. Immediate family, extended family, and there is no limit to extended family. My children, youngest son has married a Hungarian Jewish girl. His in-laws are family. My daughter has married a Swedish boy. Her in-laws are also family. And my eldest son has married an English girl. They're also family. So when we had a family reunion, we had all the in-laws, the outlaws, everybody together celebrating. And to me, that was a feeling of home. But food, films, the whole Bollywood thing, gosh, did we look for that, and the old films especially, with the box of tissues to enjoy, again, the same sensation of what took place in the drive-in cinema in Mombasa. Let's recreate it. So there's a bit of recreation, but there is a bit of adjustment. We're now here. How do we adapt here? That was a tough bit, because always that became a challenge for the older generation, but the younger generation, my children, no problem at all meeting others and getting married outside, but we never stopped them. We said, no, do where you feel is right and go for it. And we have 7 beautiful grandchildren. Fusion, absolutely beautiful. Picture is in the book.
Yes, it's lovely pictures. Thank you. I'll come to you on that. And just picking up on what you said about also the difficulties of migration, and we haven't really touched on the sort of sense of isolation from having come from a community and obviously coming here, and then a different type of racism moving here. So just, again, from the stories that you've uncovered from your family's experience, how did they sort of navigate that, but then also, try to make their home here? What have been the key things that you've found?
I mean, I think, so in terms of racism and their experiences.
Yeah, but then how they've sort of managed to create a home here in spite of all of that.
Yeah.
How has that worked out?
I mean, I definitely think there are different aspects to it. So one is family, but not everyone had family when they came here. There were families that were broken up as a result of expulsion. I've spoken to one person since the novel was published who talked about a family member who had been apart from their family for 18 years because they hadn't been able to get back into this country. So, there are different ways. So, yeah, for those of us who can, family is definitely one, as Hafsa was talking about. But then culture, food, music, and so on. Integration can also be another way, I think. And some people did learn the lessons from, previously to enable them to do that. But I do think it's also interesting how communities have stayed together. When you look at, for example, in Uganda, there was perhaps less prejudice against different castes and religions than there had been from what they left behind in India, on the one hand, but yet certain boundaries were still not crossed, so inter-caste, inter-religion marriages, certainly not inter-race marriages. So that's quite an interesting dynamic. But I do think what I observed both in Uganda and here is that you tend to see people becoming more close-knit, partly as a survival mechanism and partly just because of some of the cultural history and some of that colonial, as Hafsa was talking about earlier.
Thank you. And again, what sort of emotions have you found in the people that you've talked to in terms of when you've had that sense of loss? Like, how have you found that maybe affects how they view things now in terms of whether it's the focus on, saving money or the sort of metaphorical suitcase in the wardrobe kind of ready to go? Do you ever really achieve that complete assimilation and acceptance when you have gone through something like that?
I mean, the memories are deep. You asked me today, when we arrived in '67, Enoch Powell was making his Rivers of Blood speech. For me and my brothers and sisters, we were 8 of us going to school. That journey from the shop to the school, when we went on our own, was the worst journey. One of the Asian kids in the area was beaten up so badly. We said, go in 2s and 3s. Of course, we did one more thing. We realized our shop was behind Queen's Park Ranger Stadium, so we bought the blue and white scarf, blue and white hat, and the blue and white whatever we needed to be protected and not beaten up. But those memories are difficult to get rid of. But then over the years, you learn not everybody is like that. You learn actually there are some very, very good people. When the Ugandan Asians came, the story that sticks to mind is of this vicar in Kent who knew a vicar in Kampala, and he knew what's going on. He called him. He said, "My friend, our church has done a fundraise. For you, waiting here is a house and a car. Bernice Latadas is there in Kent. She recounts the story beautifully. I got her to recount it for Radio 4 so I could put it on the Sunday program. It was so touching to hear what people here were prepared to do. I met Edward Heath's advisor, who was then advising on the arrivals in Stansted. What she shared with me about the volunteers who came out, volunteers who cooked meals for people they didn't know. Now, we must never forget that aspect of migration and our gratitude to the host community for that. And that eases the way in, and it gets us to come in. Integration, big word. In my first book, Sari and Chips, there's a chapter, a brown Englishman? No, but we will integrate in a way that respects where we've come from, but adjusts to where we are living so there can be peace and harmony. And that's the critical factor, living in that way, which really enables a sort of fruition of all communities. And you see how the Asians have done, the Ugandan Asians, huge contribution to the UK economy. So that's important to acknowledge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we haven't really talked about the resettlement camps, but certainly in the work I've been doing with British Ugandan Asians at 50, where we've visited various former locations of where camps were and interviewed residents, the more positive side has also come out through those interviewees, and who are both volunteers and past residents. So to sort of, about 10 minutes left of the actual discussion before we open up, what kind of lessons, from either from your research, from your own other material, what kind of lessons should we learn from the refugee narrative? You all explore that in different ways through your books. So what kind of lessons have we learned, should we learn as a result of what happened in '72 and similar situations?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think we do need to just look at our history. That in itself is, we can say it flippantly, but not necessarily. Certainly this history isn't being taught in schools. And I've spoken to so many younger readers who said they had no idea about this. It opened up conversations with their parents. As a result, like those things that I could never have foreseen. So I think that is definitely important. Absolutely, there were people here in 1972 who not only, set up the refugee camps in army barracks, disused army barracks, but some people took them into their own homes. And those things surprised me. They absolutely shocked me, particularly in the 70s, let alone now. So those are things that we can learn from, but those stories have to be told. But also not, as we talked about earlier, not telling the rose-tinted versions. We have to be honest about, the Asian background to that, the white background to that, all of the different aspects that led to these things happening, and learn from them. It was very interesting to me that I wrote the novel when, Brexit was going on, the rise of Trump, and it was quite, in a way it helped to write the novel. So for a novelist, that's great in one sense, but it very much made me question home and where I stood in this country in a way that I hadn't for about 20 years, since I was, since the 1980s when there was a lot more racism. So I think the worry is that we're not learning and we're just sort of passing this on and on and on, and that's what I think we have to sort of counter if we can.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think for me, the thing that my novel really explores in terms of lessons to be learned from history is why it's so important for people of sort of my generation and below to understand their history and to understand, you know, where they've come from, really. That's what the whole novel explores in the contemporary perspective. Why should this guy find out anything about where he's come from? Why does he need to understand why his parents behave the way they behave? To what extent are the kind of cultural and familial expectations and duties that are placed upon him, how do they derive? Where do they come from? And so all of those things are really, really important, I think, to help ground you as a person and to help you really discover yourself, you know? And so I think that was sort of the biggest takeaway for me. Of course, there's lots of takeaways, and I second everything that Neema's already said, but I think for my novel in particular, is more about an exploration on a personal level of your own history and your own past. Get these stories before they're gone, because they're dying out with the generations as the generations go.
Yeah, and for me, the message is watch out. If there is any hint of a government policy that threatens our existence here or stability here, watch out. When I was running for mayor of London in 2000, the then government put out an edict. Any family from South Asia, and they said, oh, we're only experimenting. Yeah, experimenting with 1 billion people, thank you very much. We're only experimenting this scheme of a £10,000 bond for every relative of yours that is to visit the country. I said, we've got a wedding coming up. I've got 100 relatives coming. 100 times £10,000 is £1 million. Where will I find that? This is an unfair piece of legislation. Is it the beginning of something that is going to make us second class and then make us an easy target to either push out where I don't know? Watch out. We immediately ran a campaign saying, this is wrong. Oh, I was jumping up and down BBC TV and all. Within a week, the then government, during midnight sitting of parliament, withdrew the legislation. So watch out. Don't let any such thing ever get into fester the situation and community relations. Our stability is at stake. So we need to be on our guard, politically engaged, socially engaged, and community engaged to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen. So that's a lesson I hope gets learned by the new generation. The further back you look in history, the more you can look forward. And if you don't look for that bit of history, we end up the losers potentially. So watch out, be careful, don't let it happen again.
Thank you. And I think we've got 5 minutes of the chat left. Picking up on what Ram just said about sharing the stories, were either of you surprised by your own generation, for example, cousins, etc., who were not so aware of this history? And how important is it that we build this into our own education system, for example, or other ways that we know the sort of empire history that relates to why we have such mixed communities here? How much do you think people have learned from your books about that, from the people that you spoke to?
I mean, forget my cousins. I knew very little before I started researching this book. I knew from when I was very, very young, so again in the 80s, I had a vague idea of these people that had to leave Uganda within 90 days, and it really stayed in my mind because it seemed like something that could happen to me. And then you have kids saying, go back to your own country, and I often thought about, what is that country for me? Is it Kenya or Tanzania? Is it India? I've never been to those countries. All these things that sort of arose, but that's all I knew. I didn't know very much about how the expulsion came about, the political reasons, the economical reasons that it came about. I knew very little about the experiences. During my research, I found out about women who'd experienced sexual assault and things like that, which again are not very much talked about as part of this history for cultural reasons, for stigma and other reasons. So I've learned so much, but yeah, it's been amazing. There's been lots of family members. I have a big family, so lots of people who read it. And again, said had no idea about any of this. And as I said, having conversations with family members in a way that they'd never had. And I've had conversations as well. So that, I hope, happens more and more. And then there's also the aspect of those who aren't from Asian backgrounds, who didn't know anything about it, whether young or old. Obviously, some older people will remember it from the news stories, but what was the story behind that? So I'm hoping that our books can tell a bit more of that story to people that didn't know anything about it, and we can learn from it.
And finally, Hafsa.
Yeah, I mean, I second everything that Neema said. I didn't really know anything about the story. I mean, at least I'm not of that background, but still, my in-laws were. And to be fair, I mean, my friends and things of that background, it's not something that we discuss. Like I mentioned earlier, one of my friend's fathers, I mean, I didn't know that she was South Asian Ugandan until I wrote this book. And she's been in my life for years and years, you know, and I just never knew. And then I found my other contemporaries who were South Asian, but not East African South Asian, also didn't know the story. So some of my friends whose family had emigrated from Pakistan had no idea. And I thought, do you know what, if our own communities don't know these stories, what chance have the rest of the population got? So yeah, look, fiction is an incredibly important tool for communicating these kinds of histories. And I obviously don't want to overstate what my book specifically has done within that. But it's vital, it's crucial, because if they're not getting into the history curriculum, you know, you can go to English Lit and maybe read, you know, Heart of Darkness and then learn, oh, okay, at least I know the Belgian were in the Congo, and let me go on the internet and look it up. I mean, I'm talking about what happened to me specifically. Before that, I didn't even know anything about the empire because I was learning about mummified Egyptians, which is obviously super important and interesting, but perhaps not super relevant. But yeah, so look, it's a process, and I think we're making inroads, and you know, like you said, books published on this topic in the same year, and there's more coming. There's this book called A Burning, or have you been, okay, A Burning or something like that, by Meg, someone or the other. I think that's just been published, and it's on the same topic, and it's fiction. So you know, we're making inroads, and we're getting there, and more of these stories are being told, and perhaps the quickest way to do it is through literature. Rather than, I mean, we have to keep pushing the national curriculum agenda as well, but I think literature is a you know, a low-hanging fruit for now.
Yeah, my granddaughter, when she read my book, read how I was smacked at school for being late. You know what her reaction? Oh, Papa, that's so cruel. That shouldn't be allowed. Did you sue your teacher? I said, hello. We never had anything like that. So I said, and these young kids are so up to it. I said, if I'm very strict with you, you're going to call your social worker. I better be careful. So, you know, there's a different generation. But they learn. When she read that, it really touched her. She said, goodness, what a world you lived in. I said, yep, that's what you need to learn and understand. But we go on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of that. I'm going to open up to the floor. Out of interest, and I should have asked this earlier, how many are from an East African Asian background? It's quite a good handful, yeah. So yeah, we'll take some questions. Try and take 2 or 3 at a time, and then where is lady here? Yeah, sure.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting discussion. I'm from the Zambian diaspora, and in the 80s, we were haunted by what happened in Uganda. And as a child, I used to ask my elders, why was it Asians who were, you know, evicted from Uganda? How did you explain this question to the younger generation? Thank you.
Thank you. Take another one.
Hi, thank you for a really informative talk. So I think the elephant in the room is the figure of Idi Amin, and I just wondered if you could talk a bit about how he's thought about now in different generations in Uganda and East African Asians, and kind of the idea of him, you know, what does he symbolize now still?
Thank you. And we'll just take one more, and then we'll address those.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting talk, family from Kenya and Tanzania. And I'm just fascinated to understand how you started these discussions with people from, you know, who moved over, because obviously it is a history we're aware of, but, you know, getting people to open up. I'm just wondering whether you've got any tips on how we can do that with family members and friends and sort of get those stories told.
Thank you. Who'd like to take the first one, which was the lady from Zambia?
Why Asians?
Yeah.
My answer to the children is very clear. We did not behave as proper citizens. That is a fact. I saw it with my own eyes. As I said in my response earlier, we just treated the African as a second-class citizen. The Europeans treated them as third-class citizens. I think that is where the problem starts. Can we learn to respect all human beings as created equally, with equal human rights, and that we love one and all without prejudice? That, I think, is the message. And that's what I reinforce to my children. see what happened to us. Don't let it ever happen to us again.
Can I just add to that, which is just to say that, again, like, of course, we should take some blame, but I think also the colonial policies that were in place at the time were a massive factor in why the South Asian population treated the native population like that. They were copying what the Europeans were doing. They were also put in a place where they were economically, socially, politically above the native population. And so, of course, if you're put in that position, you're going to think that you are superior in all those respects. I mean, the system was made so that they would not be, divide and rule, like you said earlier, divide and rule. It was created and it was structured in that way purposefully. And so, I think the resentment that arose in the local population as a result of that segregation was something that was quite natural in response. And the British left, and there was a good sort of roughly 10-year period before the expulsion actually happened. And you can see in the history of what was happening, locally, in the politically, socially, all these small things that were leading up to the big event itself. And of course, you saw in the neighboring countries in Kenya and Tanzania all these social exclusion policies and all these economic exclusion policies, which ended up, which resulted in a lot of mass migration prior to Uganda's decree. But the most dramatic example of it, of course, was Idi Amin's decree. But I do just think that we have to remember that what happened is directly as a result of the way in which the British divided and ruled.
Thank you. Neema, I'd like to answer that question as well, but you may want to sort of tie it in with, the elephant in the room and Idi Amin and the Africanization policies that, like you said, it was a build-up, it wasn't a sudden event.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, yeah, colonial rule was a big part of that. I think to an extent, Idi Amin used them as a scapegoat, as we've seen in history many times before, most significantly perhaps, or at least on a mass scale in Germany, scapegoating of others as an economic and political policy, I suppose. So there was an aspect of that. Bear in mind, though, some of those behaviors were based in reality. People were being mistreated by Asian people in Uganda, so there was an aspect that was real. It was quite interesting to me when I went to Uganda to do my research, and I had a tour guide for one of the days, and she was in her 20s. And it was quite surprising to me because I knew that there obviously had to have been, for Idi Amin to get into power, he obviously had support at the time. But I had figured that based on what he then went on to do, which was to kill up to 500,000 Ugandans, on top of everything that happened to Ugandan Asians, I figured that the way he'd be looked at now would be, quite darkly and negatively. But actually she was talking about how her parents and her grandparents said, well, we look at what's happening in Uganda now, and there's still quite big disparities in terms of rich and poor and tribal disparities as well. And she said, actually, not everything he did was wrong. He was trying to give power back to the Africans. She was talking about that aspect of it. So it's definitely a grey area. There's lots of different, multiple points of view, and that's why, it's so important for not just one fiction book to be written about it, and not just one, memoir, whatever. We need to read lots of different perspectives to really understand what happened at that time and why it happened.
Sorry, can I just add to that as well? Of course, with Amin, there was a coup, so he took power by force because he was a military man, and that happened in 71, and before him there had been a bote. And I think the thing that probably all of our novels explore is potentially like how, or at least mine does certainly, how the South Asian population viewed Idi Amin. And, he was kind of a buffoon, and he was this ridiculous title with like 50 different accolades, and he was like the king of all the seas and all this kind of stuff. He was pretty intense. But I don't think, at least that my novel anyway, explores what the local population thought of him. And so I guess that's just something that's open somebody else to write, or maybe us to write the next one. But yeah, it's. I think he was viewed quite negatively, obviously, by the South Asians, but I think the local population probably saw more good in him.
While I take the point about blaming other people, we still have a responsibility. We still have an accountability as citizens, whatever the environment, not to give in. And I think that is where we were weak. We did not fight that sort of stuff being put on us. And many Asians in South Africa, the Asians were called the Coloreds. The Coloreds joined the blacks with Mandela and others, and there's a whole lot of stories to fight those who were promoting apartheid It takes time. It takes a lot of time, but they were prepared to do that. Nothing like that happened to my knowledge when I was growing up. Nobody stood up. And I think that, again, is a message. Stand up, speak out. There will be a risk, but it's worth doing.
Thank you. And the third question was around, I was fascinated about how you sort of started these discussions with people. How did you first broach topics that you'd perhaps never talked to people about? I'll come to Hafsa first.
Yeah, I mean, look, I obviously started with my in-laws because, you know, they were alive and well, and they could tell me the stories of the expulsion. And to be fair, way before I decided to write the novel, pretty much from the first day I met my future in-laws, I was told about their history. Like, they were very vocal, and you know, they wanted to explain why they were the way they were now. You know, the thing you were saying before about, you know, saving pennies and keeping cash under the mattress and suitcase on the, you know, just in case type thing. So, you know, I found it all fascinating, and so that's how I kind of started, and I had that history, and I had those anecdotes, and I had this wonderful picture being painted up for me, and then I obviously had an opportunity later to turn those stories into a novel, and I was very fortunate in that respect. But I think one of the questions the man asked was, you know, how do we make sure that we keep, well, what I can say, you know, how do we make sure we keep these generations talking about the stories? Like, you know, I would say, buy my book. Buy her book, buy his book, and give these books to that generation and help them through fiction, through reading. You don't have to have this direct conversation with them, but maybe after they read the novels, they then feel more comfortable. Other people are talking about this. The whole world is talking about this. I can talk about this now. Because I think one of the things that that generation do tend to do is to bottle things up. They don't want to talk about the fact that they had kind of any emotional weakness or any mental, you know, instability or any kind of trauma. They're fine, they're solid, they're sturdy. You know, we're walking on the shoulders and all of that. But I think that's one route to which we can, you know, get that generation more engaged and willing to talk.
Yeah, I'll come to you both. I just wanted to pick up on that and just say that I've certainly had family members who've said things like, oh, kind of grateful that it happened almost. And I think that's part of the trauma of not wanting to talk about it and just saying, well, I've made a good life for myself despite that. But actually there's obviously a lot of unexplored emotions in that. So
Blessing in disguise.
Blessing in disguise,
all that we hear as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, in terms of why I wrote and for why did I put this down for the children and grandchildren was because when lockdown happened, we couldn't have a party to celebrate my 70th. So these children and grandchildren contacted friends and relatives across the globe and produced an amazing video. And once they produced it, they then asked me, oh, but Papa, who are all these people? So I start writing stories. When I start writing stories, my publisher, who's here, standing at the back there, heard about it and said, I want to publish that book. And I'm so glad he did, because I didn't want to. And now the children have an access to these stories in your books and mine, saying, we think we have some understanding and we can begin a journey of exploration to see what took place and who we are, what our identities and where it has come from.
Thank you. And Neema, we'll end with Neema, and I think we won't have much time after that.
Yeah, but, sorry, I was going to say something a bit sad to start, I suppose, which is we should ask those other generations about their experiences, but we have to remember how traumatic it was. You know, they weren't just ripped from their home, though, that they saw and experienced, as I said, physical assault, sexual assault. They will have seen murdered body. You know, that is so significant if we think about it. And it's partly the reason why some people don't talk about it. So I think we do have to tread really carefully. But if you're able to obviously have those conversations, or at least even work around them, like what was the childhood like before then, and things like that, that's one way. But other than that, there are resources. As I said, you know, one of the things that I would definitely say, if anyone is interested, is to look at the SOAS. It's called the Exiles Project, the SOAS videos. They did that for the 40th anniversary, and there's countless interviews with different people, so you get different experiences. Some had better experiences than others, and it also includes Black Ugandan experiences. So that, I would say, is definitely worth having a look at.
Thank you. Yeah, there's definitely an awful lot of resources out there, certainly more than before. And I think the anniversaries, in a way, have really helped that. They kind of propel things when you've got a 40th and a 50th. So yeah, I just want to say, let's have a look. Oh, actually, we still have a little bit of time, so I could take a couple more questions. Oh, sorry, and a lady over there as well.
Number 9.
Thanks, Meera.
you know, you look around, we've got Rishi Sunak, Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, Hamza Yusuf, you know, Freddie Mercury for that matter. What do East African Asian, what attributes do you think they bring to this country that makes them successful versus a South Asian diaspora who came directly from the subcontinent?
Thank you. And the lady over there, because I think she was from before.
Right.
I'll take Francis's and then to you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, it's been really heartening to hear that you are looking at the, you know, what actually happened and telling the story. But there's no excuse. You know, you had to stand up and be counted. I come from Guyana and I've lived through that, and we stood up to be counted. But what my question is, readership. Are you reaching those that you want to, other than family members?
Thank you. And we'll take one more there.
Hi, thanks very much. It's a very interesting conversation, but I want to disagree with Ram Gidoomal because my family is from East Africa too, and I disagree with this narrative that the Asians really didn't do anything. You know, I know from my father's generation that he was involved in terms of Tanzania, Kenya, and there were lots of other local people there. And also right now we've got the Madhwani, who happens to be the High Commissioner of Uganda. I feel that, you know, we are sort of tend to flagellate ourselves that the Asians were horrible to the Africans. It's become a bit of a simplistic narrative trope, and we don't really look at a more complex picture about that history, because that thing works both ways. But on the other side, there were a lot of Asians who were involved in the kind of freedom of East African countries from the colonial yoke. We're talking about in the 50s and 60s, and that history is not really very well known. I mean, we are excavating it through these 40th Asians, 50th, all that, and the focus in this country has really been on Uganda because, you know, Edward Heath did a great thing. He saved the Asians from Uganda. But what about the Asians who were expelled from Kenya in the 60s? You know, so I really feel like I'm advocating for us to have a bit more of a nuanced approach to it, and I'd just like to have your comments on that. Thank you.
I mean, I agree with you. You know, my own family, my uncle, I remember Tom Mboya coming to his home. I remember freedom fighters coming to his home in Nairobi. In Mombasa, I remember Mr. Pandya, A.J. Pandya, running for parliament. So yes, there were few and far between, and those examples were there. But from a child growing up in that environment and right up to my O-levels, I wish I had seen more. And I just felt the systems and procedures, and this is your point as well, which I agree with, that somehow what had been put there made it easier to leave the status quo than to challenge it. Yes, Madhwani, great respect for him. I put him in my book, The UK Maharajas. He's got a whole chapter there. I know his daughter, who's the Ugandan ambassador here. So yes, there are, of course, there, but I suppose I'm a frustrated person who wants to have seen much more happen, much more quickly, without the barriers put on there.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to ask you literally 5-word answers. Readership outreach and the attributes of East African Asians versus South Asian, if you'd like to. Or you
it's not going to be 5 words, but I will say, I mean, I think that's a different portrayal of Ugandan or East African Asians. People like Rishi and Priti are not necessarily learning from our own experiences, what came before, and so sorry, it's a political answer. But it really worries me that we're almost going backwards and they're drawing up the ladder after them.
No, thank you. And just finally on outreach and then...
Yeah, I mean, readership, it's a hard question to answer because a lot of it is out of your hands. You know, it's down to your publisher and your marketing and your publicity and, you know, who's published you and when. I mean, yeah, and every single individual here who hasn't bought our book yet. But no, it's not really in the author's hands is the problem. Once you've written the novel, it just then goes off into the world and you know, you can only champion it as much as you can.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's a brilliant panel, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.